So my favorite webinar that I've ever done was the very first Podcasters Paradise webinar, where we decided to open up our community of listeners of Entrepreneur on Fire, of followers of EntrepreneurOnFire.com, to the opportunity to learn from me how to create, grow, and monetize a podcast and turn it into a webinar form. I say it was fun, and it was, but it was also terrifying because I had never done a webinar before. I had never set up one. I didn't really know the basics behind creating a webinar, hosting a webinar, presenting that webinar, and then of course trying to convert people into our paid community, Podcasters Paradise, at the end. So it was a terrifying experience, but I also look back on it as my most rewarding and fun, because when I made that pitch at the end of the webinar and I started seeing the sales come in, I realized that I was onto something. And in the next year, I did 60 live webinars. So the webinar that by far gave me the best feedback of all the webinars that I've done would be my first Webinar on Fire webinar, where I actually teach people on a webinar how to create and present webinars that convert. And what was really cool about that is people were able to see me in action. With the podcast workshop and with that webinar, it was very effective because I could show some training about how to do an actual podcast, but it's limited on a webinar. But with doing an actual webinar about how to do webinars, it makes so much sense that it's almost funny in a way, but the reality is that I was able to walk people through every single step of that webinar process, break it down in a very fundamental way so that they could really understand what it takes fundamentally to go from step one to step done of a webinar, all the way from understanding what you're going to present to getting the hosting set up. And if you're going to use Google Hangouts, GoToWebinar, Easy Webinar, any of the platforms that are out there, to actually creating that killer presentation that's just packed with value, but then leads people into wanting more at the end. And that's that conversion part where a lot of people have a hard time at. If you want to be, do. It's a simple quote. It's a simple statement, but nobody does it. And then to actually successfully do a good follow-up sequence via emails and whatever that might be, to really make sure you're capturing as many people as possible that maybe weren't able to be there live, but in that replay sequence that you have. Still providing some scarcity in there, having a limited time, but realizing that there's an opportunity for people who, for any number of reasons, weren't able to be there live. So being able to teach that, how to create and present webinars that actually convert to an audience that was looking for exactly that, after having done at that point about 35 live webinars myself, so being very experienced, was just a lot of fun because I was comfortable, I was in my zone, I knew how to talk about this content because I had had a ton of experience about it, and then it was just a matter of delivering it in an understandable way, which I feel like I did.